The 1920s would bring about one of the fastest growing economic periods the United States had ever seen. Of course, industrialization in the late 1800s had created this potential booming economy as the nation began to expose itself to new products and growth. The 1920s also is a period of political challenges as the nation coming out of the progressive era, which had seen many, in some people's eyes, advancements, in other people's eyes, horrific changes to our political atmosphere. Things like the income tax, the attack on trusts and large corporations, the direct election of senators. All of these elements had given Americans greater influence and control of their government, but yet, on the other hand, had also given the government greater powers to intrude on the lives of American people. So the 1920s is an interesting period because we embark on this more modern economic system and the challenges of trying to develop a political system to match that. The 1920 presidential election is one really very little challenge. Warren G. Harding, the Republican candidate, campaigned on the slogan of a return to normalcy, and his basic premises of his policies was, as you can see in this quote, was nothing really new, but rather to go backwards. I wouldn't say go backwards isn't the appropriate word. To return to the policies of the late 1800s that had been less intrusive and allowed for Americans the ability to have greater liberties in their daily lives without government intervention. Um, he wins that election very, very quickly. The American people are encouraged by a president who is willing to keep America safe with his policy of isolation, and likewise just allow the American people to do as they see fit. The 1920s is also, we see great political or challenges from the rest of the world. Russia is going through the Bolshevik Revolution, which is the communist revolution in that country that would result in the establishment of the Soviet Union in 1929. And in this atmosphere of growing communism popularity, not only here in the United States, the socialists won many elections at the local level. It was a growing political entity at the national level, supported by labor unions and so forth. The American people became concerned that communism was going to potentially be a viable challenger to our democratic and capitalist system. The result of this is what is called the Red Scare. The red, of course, referring to the red flags of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the Bolshevik Revolution. Um, Business owners and Americans likewise were discouraged by what occurs in 1919 with vast numbers of labor strikes. Following the war, many laborers felt that they had not received adequate benefit. Businessmen had made money during the war, and the workers were now saying, "Okay, the war's over. We had sacrificed during the war because of the war effort, but now we deserve to experience higher wages and greater benefits." Um, the driving force, as many Americans and as labor implied, behind these labor strikes was the Communist Party. And this growing fear of communism leads to what is called the Red Scare, and is simply an attack on communist groups and organizations within the United States. So what we see in the 1920s is courts that will, when cases come before them about labor, they tended to side on the side of employers, leading to hostility towards labor unions and a decline in labor unions throughout the 1920s. Um, Individuals were imprisoned for communist subversion. And of course, this was all made possible by the Espionage Acts and Sedition Acts that were passed during World War I and just prior to World War I. So the basis had been there to imprison individuals who were a potential threat to the security of the nation. An instance that heightens the Red Scare is what's known as the Palmer Raids. A. Mitchell Palmer is the Attorney General of the United States, and as the Attorney General, he is responsible for bringing cases against individuals who would challenge the authority of the United States and break the laws of the federal government, and he would be responsible for trying potential communists. Um, he receives a bomb in the mail, and it explodes, and this attack on him leads him to basically go after any communists. And what is known as the Palmer Raids are carried out as the Attorney General uses his law enforcement capabilities, the FBI, other federal agencies, to begin rounding up anyone who was suspected of communist activities and imprisoning them. The Palmer Raids do not come to an end until public support for them begins to dwindle. Over time, people begin to look at Palmer as being a little bit radical and a little bit overstepping his bounds as Attorney General by imprisoning people who, in some cases, were in no way associated with the Communist Party. Another example of the growing fears of communists as well as immigrants, especially Eastern Europeans. During the late 1800s and early part of the 1900s, the United States had seen growing numbers of immigrants from places like Russia and the Slavic countries of Poland, Italy, and other Eastern European countries who were no doubt physically different. They looked different than the Western Europeans, the British and the Scandinavians. They spoke different languages. They practiced different religions, many of them Jews, many of them Catholics. Of course, the unrest in Europe during the war and after the war had led many to seek exile in the United States. The Russian Revolution was encouraging Russian Jews and others to get out of Russia and come to the United States. So a lot of things are going on in Europe that are bringing these new immigrants. And many Americans feared that with these new immigrants would come those philosophies and ideas that were not in tradition to American ideals. Anyway, the Sacco and Vanzetti case is the case of two Italian immigrants who were accused of, convicted of, and executed for a murder that, as evidence, as people look back at it now, is very circumstantial evidence. Very little physical evidence put them in conjunction with the crime, but nevertheless, they were executed for this crime, and primarily on the simple reasons of their heritage, and that Americans were fearful of these groups and wanted to set an example that they would be dealt very harshly with. As I mentioned, we see an increase in labor strikes during the time period. And that's very early on, 1919, early 1920. By the mid-1920s, though, we start to see labor issues decline as labor unions lose their support. And throughout the 1920s, Republicans would dominate the political atmosphere. Probably not probably because primarily of the discussed with the Wilson administration and the changes that had occurred during the progressive movement. A more conservative approach to politics was wanted by the American people. So throughout the 1920s, we see a very conservative type of political atmosphere, one in which carried over to the court systems that were very pro corporations and very pro business. Warren Harding is a popular president, generally liked by the American people. Probably is not a very good administrator. He did put some very capable people into his administration, though. Herbert Hoover, of course, one of the most renowned administrators in American history, who had reorganized or had organized the food industries during World War One, now takes on the Commerce Department and will begin the process of reorganizing it to encourage business growth. Charles Evans Hughes, Secretary of State, and will work very actively to reduce military spending as well as military buildups throughout the world. Andrew Mellon, a keen businessman, becomes Treasury Secretary and will put in place the economic policies of the 1920s that are very pro-business. Andrew Mellon also will later be criticized for those policies as the architect for the Great Depression because of the lack of oversight throughout the 1920s. Harding, though, will be ridiculed for many other appointments that will eventually lead to corruption and challenges. Foreign policy, again drafted primarily by Charles Evans Hughes. During the 1920s, the United States wanted a isolationist policy. We wanted out of world affairs, but nevertheless, we took a leading step in trying to reduce the ills of what created World War I, bringing leading nations to Washington in the 1920s to negotiate disarmament agreements to reduce the military stores and supplies of our neighboring nations. Primarily, our focus as Americans was in the Pacific with the Japanese and the British and the French in those regions to try and secure a more stable environment for us to conduct our business activities in Asia. Also during the 1920s, we see a revert to the tariff policies of the late 1800s with the Forney-McCumber Tariff Act, as well as others that would, on 3 occasions, raise tariffs to some of their highest levels in American history. The impact on this worldwide, though, is catastrophic, as America was one of the few industrial nations that had the capabilities to purchase goods. So, when we increase our tariffs, our European competitors likewise increase their tariffs, and we see a real stranglehold on worldwide trade. The ability of the Europeans to rebuild their economies after World War I is handcuffed by these tariffs, as Americans are not able to purchase European goods, or not encouraged to. So in the event that we are needing repayment of our war loans to the British and the French, Charles Dawes comes up with a plan in 1924 to loan Germany money so that the Germans are able to pay off and rebuild their industries, to pay off their debts, reparation payments to the British and the French. And then the British and the French could then pay the Americans. So really creating a circle of money amongst those nations. Domestically, we see an attack on immigration. And in 1921 and 1924, immigration laws are put in place to limit the number of immigrants from many nations of the of Europe. And in this graphic, or in this cartoon that you can see here, is you see the funneling of ethnic groups. And in the 1924 Immigration Act, the United States targeted certain nations, such as Russia, to limit the number of Russians. And how it was done in the Quota Act was they took the population numbers of Russian immigrants in the late 1800s, in which during the late 1800s very few Russians were immigrating to the United States. They took those numbers and then they set a quota, a percentage of that number. So if there were 1,000 immigrants allowed from Russia in 1880, they might say 1% or 2% of that number would be allowed into the United States in 1925, thus making it virtually impossible for Russians to immigrate to the United States. As I mentioned, Harding's appointment of some individuals, especially his friends such as Albert B. Fall as Secretary of the Interior, would really come back to bite him. In the growing economic atmosphere of the 1920s, especially with automobiles and the petroleum industry, the desire to open up government lands for oil drilling exploration encouraged Fall to negotiate an agreement with oil companies to begin drilling on government lands. In return for his encouragement to allow those people to drill there, he received $300,000 in direct payments. That controversy is made public, and of course President Harding would take the hit for that, as well as other scandals. Warren Harding dies in 1923. He is replaced by his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, who's known as Silent Cal, who is generally considered to be an okay president, probably not the best administrator, but an effective one. And his presidency is really one of limited intervention. He really is not very active. You know, the quote, America's business, or the business of America is business. And he believed that the government should just really stay out of it as much as possible. So we see a booming industry, manufacturing industry in the United States. Foreign policy-wise, he would carry on Harding's isolationism, and the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1927 basically outlawed war. Presidential election of 1928 is one that is hotly contested, as Herbert Hoover, a well-respected administrator, as I mentioned earlier, is challenged by Alfred Smith. And by 1928, prohibition is becoming a controversial issue. Most people believe that prohibition is costing Americans more than it is hurting them in terms of the crime that had been created, but also in the lost tax revenue from that industry. Nevertheless, Hoover was able to carry the votes in the Midwest and in the South, where prohibition was very, very popular, and was elected president. During the 1920s, we see a massive economic boom, and the result of that is a transformation of our economy. Instead of an economy that is entirely based on production, we now see the emergence of a consumer economy, in which Americans were more and more capable of participating as buyers rather than just labor and producers. So what is driving this economy is the desire to get more and more Americans available to produce or to purchase goods. To do so, we see higher wages, we see the emergence of advertising, we see new products emerge, and the lower cost of producing those goods, as well as the availability of credit. Credit will be a driving force in this consumer economy. Most Americans did not have cash on hand to purchase a radio or a refrigerator, or definitely not a new car. So the emergence of this nifty installment plan where you would put money down and then pay off that product over a long period of time would enable the larger numbers of Americans to actually buy those goods, thus encouraging, or not encouraging, but creating a greater demand. During the 1920s, we see the emergence of electric power become widespread in cities, and with the advent of, once you had that outlet in your wall, you wanted things to plug into that outlet. So we see the emergence of goods available to the homes, refrigerators, washing machines, radios, just about everything that you can imagine, lamps, were now being produced and utilized for the average home. And as you can see, the value of electric products grew from 1 million to 2.3 billion during this time period. The credit boom, though, was a sleeping monster for the Americans. And in this graphic, you can see that from 1920 to 1935, Americans' debt was growing very, very rapidly. And I included in this chart the growth of debt as experienced in the late 20th century, and just at the turn of the 21st century, to give you an example of how the growing debt has impacted our economy even to today. Advertising becomes an industry of its own during the 1920s to try and get more and more Americans to purchase those goods. Nifty magazine advertisements, radio advertisements, and the emerging video advertisements at the movie theaters would encourage Americans to buy just about anything. Babe Ruth, as you can see on the left side, is encouraging Americans to go out and purchase White Owl cigars. Okay, the Oreo, everybody's favorite, was advertised, and the use of color in the packaging was very, very important. And then at the bottom, a automobile advertisement. Americans were producing more than they ever had. Gross national product grew by an average of 6% a year during this time period. And manufacturers were constantly looking at different ways to make production more efficiently, and none was more effective at doing so than Henry Ford. During the 1920s, the emergence of Ford Motor Company will be one of the great business stories of the decade. In 1908, he sold 30,000 Model Ts in 1908. By the 1920s, he's selling much, much more than that. And the reason he is able to produce so many is because he made them cheap. He produced a car that only came in one color, and that was black. He produced them with just the basic features, and it was a practical car. It was effective for most Americans, and as you can see in the price drop, by 1915, it is a very, very affordable automobile. The transformation of the automobile, of course, will bring about great changes for the American way of life. The assembly line in Detroit, what he will call River Rouge, is basically his factory town. He produced everything there. He manufactured all his parts. He got into the steel industries, and just as Carnegie and Rockefeller had done, he tried to produce as much on site as possible to reduce the cost of that production. And what was at the time a very unpopular move was the emergence of his $5 a day pay rate. He did this in order to encourage America, or basically to get the best people possible. But also, by paying his workers $5 a day, um, he could make it more affordable for them to buy cars. So by giving them the money for their labor, he would also create greater or more a greater number of consumers. But the work was hard. He was constantly looking for ways to speed up the assembly line, and many people figured out that that $5 a day maybe wasn't worth the labor. The automobile industry, as I said, Ford Motor Company and others will really, really take off and transform the American economy. With the automobile comes new industries, gas stations, motels, rubber industries, petroleum, glass, almost anything you can think of that went into an automobile or any place an automobile could go um, led to new types of businesses. The aviation industry grew rapidly as Americans sought faster and faster transportation. More and more Americans were beginning to fly. And we see the growth of industry in almost every aspect because of this growing consumer economy. And here in this graphic, you can see the growth in production, the gross national product, 1929, and then you see the spike there in 1929. So throughout that decade, Americans were producing more and more and more. Not everyone, though, experienced a great economic boom of the 1920s. For many, the 1920s were just like any other decade. Wages on average for labor during the 1920s stagnated, probably reaching its peak somewhere in the middle of the decade. By the late 1920s, wages are beginning to decline. Farming economy was horrendous during the 1920s. After the World War I boom, in which American farmers were encouraged to expand and expand and expand to feed the rest of the world. When the war ends, that demand declines, and farmers were left really high and dry. They had borrowed to expand, and now were left with those loans. Many going bankrupt. You see the wages here is as they kind of really stagnate throughout the 1920s. The decline in farm prices, you see that peak there at about 1919, 1920, and then the sharp collapse. On the exterior, the economy appeared strong. Jacob Raskob's famous quote, "Everybody ought to be rich," was the attitude of many. The stock market had boomed during the 1920s, and for those who had the cash to play in the stock market, they were getting richer. And in some instances, some of them, as we'll learn as we talk about the causes of the Great Depression, enormously rich by the games that they played on the stock market. But for many Americans, that wasn't the case. Welfare capitalism sought to eliminate labor unions by providing benefits, and the term welfare capitalism is what is meant to describe that instead of having labor unions negotiate for benefits, that business owners were responsible for providing those benefits. So it was the obligation of a manufacturer, of a company owner, to provide the benefits that workers needed in order to eliminate the need for labor unions. Economic danger signs of the time period, primarily what you have is just a growing gap between the rich and the poor. Those, like I said, those that had money to invest and expand their businesses were able to do so. But the growing amount of wealth that was controlled by a smaller and smaller group of people made it appear like the American economy was growing, but for the average American, things were pretty much as they had been. 71% of the nation's individuals earned less than $2,500 a year, while you had several individuals who were making, a guy like Henry Ford is making $1 million a week. And so for many, the prosperity of the 1920s just wasn't a reality. Instead, what many Americans did is to try to be a part of that consumer economy. They were encouraged to incur debt, and most people believe it was fine. That things were always going to be good. That the economy was going to just continue to grow and grow and grow. You were always going to have a job. So the idea of going out and purchasing a car and paying it off for a long period of time really didn't bother anybody because they did not believe that things would change. But when things do change, that extensive amount of debt that they had incurred will mean a great financial tragedy for them. The stock market, as I mentioned, was a really growing element of the time period. People were encouraged to get into the stock market as a means of getting rich quick. And during the 1920s, we see a lot of people take their life savings and put it into the stock market to invest in companies such as General Electric or RCA, or Ford Motor Company, who were growing very, very rapidly. And they were encouraged to buy on the margin, meaning that they would only have to put down 10%. So if they wanted to make a $1,000 investment, they only had to come up with $100 in cash. And if that stock went up, great. If the stock declined, then they were responsible for paying back that loan. By the mid 1920s, definitely the 1926, 1927, you're starting to see things slow down. The consumer economy just was saturated with goods. There was just so much stuff that Americans no longer could purchase it all. And this lack of demand led to a decline, of course, in sales. So corporations, by the latter part of the 1920s, began to cut back. They reduced production. They began laying off workers. They began reducing wages, taking away benefits. Really kind of a sign of things to come, that the economy had just kind of outgrown itself. And then the agriculture area was a real telltale sign of the problems that existed. In rural areas such as Nebraska, the economy was very, very slow. During the 1920s, 6,000 rural banks failed because those banks had been encouraged to loan out large sums of money to farmers so that they could expand. Well, during the 1920s, when the crop prices fell, those farmers could not pay back their loans, and not only did the farmer fail, but also the bank failed. Um, Farmers and businessmen, bankers, look to the government for help. Kind of, in our world today of the too big to fail ideology, where the American taxpayers bail out companies when they overextend themselves. During the 1920s, the Coolidge administration said no. If you can't make it, then you deserve to fail. And farm relief bills were passed, such as the McNary-Haugen Farm Relief Bill, designed to try and create some price supports for farmers, but it was vetoed by Coolidge. It wasn't in his philosophy to help these individuals out. And the economic hardships of the agriculture industry, as I said, were a mirror of what was